Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a subject that's both fascinating and frankly a little heartbreaking, rhinoceroses.
Yeah.
You've asked for a deeper look at these incredible creatures,
Mm.
and we're going beyond the basic facts to uncover their surprising history, their unique characteristics,
Right.
and the challenges that they face in a world increasingly dominated by humans. Joining us is an expert in rhinoceros biology and conservation. I'm excited to learn more about these magnificent animals, and I'm sure you are too.
It's a pleasure to be here. Rhinos are truly remarkable, and their story is one that deserves to be told and understood.
All right, let's dive right in. I have to admit, when I hear rhinos, the first thing that pops into my head is that iconic horn.
Sure.
But I know there's so much more to these animals than meets the eye. For starters, how many different species of rhinoceros are there?
There are actually 5 extant rhinoceros species, meaning 5 species that are still alive today. It's a surprisingly small number when you consider their evolutionary history, which spans millions of years.
5 species, millions of years of evolution. Okay, I'm already intrigued. Can we break down those 5 species and where they're found?
Absolutely. Let's start with the 2 African species. We have the white rhinoceros, the largest of all rhino species, and the black rhinoceros, which despite its name, isn't actually black. Both species are primarily grazers, meaning they feed mainly on grasses.
Wait, so the black rhinoceros isn't black? I'm sensing a theme here, misleading names.
You're right. The names white and black are thought to be misinterpretations of the Dutch word wide, meaning wide, which refers to the white rhino's wide mouth, adapted for grazing. The black rhino, in contrast, has a pointed mouth, better suited for browsing on leaves and twigs. So in reality, both species are more of a grayish color.
That makes sense. It's a reminder that common names can sometimes be more confusing than helpful.
Exactly. Now moving on to Asia, we have 3 rhinoceros species. The Indian rhinoceros, also known as the greater one-horned rhinoceros, is found in parts of India and Nepal. It's characterized by its single, impressive horn and its thick, armor-like skin folds.
I've always been fascinated by those skin folds. They give the Indian rhino such a prehistoric look.
They're quite striking, and they actually serve a purpose. The folds help to regulate body temperature and protect the rhino from vegetation while it's moving through dense undergrowth.
Form and function, all in one? What about the other 2 Asian species?
We have the Javan rhinoceros, which is sadly one of the most endangered large mammals on the planet. Only a small population remains confined to a single national park in Java, Indonesia. And then there's the Sumatran rhinoceros, the smallest and hairiest of all rhino species.
The Sumatran rhino sounds like a real outlier. Small, hairy, and living in the dense rainforests of Sumatra. It's amazing how much diversity exists within this relatively small group of animals.
It is, and each species has unique adaptations that allow it to thrive in its particular environment. But sadly, as you mentioned, several of these species are facing an uncertain future.
That brings us to a topic I'm both eager and hesitant to discuss. The threats facing rhinoceroses today. I know poaching is a major issue, but what else is contributing to their decline?
Poaching, driven by the illegal trade in rhino horn, is undeniably the most pressing threat. But habitat loss, human-wildlife conflict, and the effects of climate change are also taking a toll.
Okay, so a combination of factors is putting these animals at risk. Before we delve into those threats, I'd love to step back and learn more about the evolutionary history of rhinoceroses. Where do they come from, and how did they become the incredible creatures we see today?
That's a great question, and one that takes us back millions of years. To understand the modern rhino, we need to go back to the Eocene epoch, about 56 to 34 million years ago.
Wow, we're talking deep time here. What did the earliest rhinos look like?
Imagine a small, hornless creature resembling a tapir or a small horse. That's Hyraceus eximus, the ancestor of all rhinoceroses. It was a far cry from the massive, armored animals we see today.
So no horns, no armor-like skin. It's amazing to think that these little guys evolved into the rhinos we know and love today.
Evolution is a powerful force, and the story of rhinoceros evolution is a fascinating one. Over millions of years, rhinos diversified into a wide array of forms, some of which were truly bizarre.
Okay, I have to hear about these bizarre rhinos. What were they like?
One group, known as the running rhinos, were adapted for speed and looked more like horses than modern rhinos. Then there were the hippo-like rhinos, which lived in and around water, much like hippos do today. And perhaps most impressive were the giant indracotheres, some of which were larger than a bull African elephant.
Larger than an elephant. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. What happened to all these incredible creatures?
Extinction is a natural part of life's history. Over millions of years, many rhino lineages went extinct due to a combination of factors including climate change, competition, and in some cases, likely human activity. But thankfully, a few lineages survived and gave rise to the 5 species we have today.
It's a reminder that the natural world is constantly changing and that survival is never guaranteed. But for now, let's focus on those 5 survivors and learn more about what makes them so special.
I'd be happy to delve into the fascinating details of each species. Where would you like to start?
Let's go back to the white rhinoceros. I'm curious to learn more about this gentle giant, especially considering the misleading name.
The white rhinoceros is a true icon of the African savanna. It's the largest of all rhino species, with males weighing up to a staggering 2,400 kilograms. That's bigger than some cars.
I'm trying to picture that, a 2,400 kilogram herbivore grazing peacefully on the grasslands. It's hard to imagine something that massive being threatened by human actions.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? Despite their size and strength, white rhinos are incredibly vulnerable, especially to poaching.
Right. We'll definitely get into the threats they face, but first I'd love to learn more about what makes this species unique. What are some of their key characteristics besides their impressive size?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, white rhinos have a wide, square-shaped mouth, perfectly adapted for grazing on grasses. They also have a prominent hump on their back, which supports their massive head as they graze. And of course, there are the horns.
Speaking of horns, I've always wondered why rhinos have them in the first place. What purpose do they serve?
Rhino horns are made of keratin, the same material that makes up our hair and nails. They're not attached to the skull bone, but rather grow from a dense mass of dermal papillae, which are specialized cells in the skin.
So it's like a really thick, compacted mass of hair. That's fascinating.
It is. And while the exact function of horns can vary between species, in general they're used for defense, digging, foraging, and even display during mating rituals.
It makes sense that something as prominent as a horn would have multiple uses. What about the white rhino specifically? How do they use their horns?
White rhinos typically have 2 horns, with the front horn being larger, averaging around 90 centimeters in length, but sometimes reaching up to 150 centimeters.
Wow, that's longer than my arm.
They primarily use their horns for defense against predators, particularly lions and hyenas, which may target young or vulnerable individuals. They also use them to clear obstacles and dig for water or roots. And interestingly, white rhinos have been observed using their horns to push and shove each other during dominance displays, especially during mating season.
So it's not just about defense, it's also about social signaling and navigating their environment.
Exactly. Unfortunately, those magnificent horns are also the reason why white rhinos and all rhino species are facing such dire threats.
Right. The demand for rhino horns in the illegal wildlife trade, it's a heartbreaking reality. But before we dive into those challenges, let's continue our exploration of the other rhino species. What can you tell me about the black rhinoceros?
The black rhinoceros, while still a large and powerful animal, is significantly smaller than the white rhino, with males typically weighing up to 1,600 kilograms. As we discussed earlier, they have a pointed, prehensile upper lip which they use to grasp leaves, twigs, and fruit from trees and shrubs.
So they're more of a browser than a grazer, like the white rhino. What about their horns? Are they similar in size and shape?
Black rhinos also typically have 2 horns, but the front horn is usually shorter and more curved than that of the white rhino, averaging around 50 centimeters in length. Interestingly, there's a fair bit of variation in horn size and shape between individuals and even between populations.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation when it comes to rhino horns. What else makes the black rhino unique?
Well, they have a reputation for being more solitary and territorial than white rhinos. They're also known for their keen sense of smell and hearing, which they rely on to navigate their environment and detect potential threats.
Okay, so a bit more elusive and independent than the white rhino. What about their habitat preferences? Where are they typically found?
Black rhinos are found in a variety of habitats across sub-Saharan Africa, including savannas, woodlands, and even mountainous regions. They're highly adaptable animals, able to survive in areas with limited water and vegetation.
It sounds like they're real survivors. But sadly, I know that they, like all rhino species, are facing a number of threats.
You're right. Habitat loss due to human encroachment in agriculture is a major concern. And of course, poaching for their horns continues to decimate their populations.
It's truly tragic. Let's move on to the Asian rhino species, starting with the Indian rhinoceros. I'm particularly intrigued by their unique appearance with those thick skin folds and the single horn. What can you tell me about them?
The Indian rhinoceros is a sight to behold. It's the second largest rhino species after the white rhino, and it has a distinctive armored appearance due to its thick skin folds. These folds are thought to help regulate body temperature and protect the rhino from vegetation as it moves through dense undergrowth.
Right, we talked about that earlier. It's an incredible adaptation. What about their horn? How does it compare to the horns of the African rhinos?
The Indian rhino has a single horn, which can grow up to 60 centimeters in length. It's generally thicker and more conical in shape than the horns of African rhinos. And like all rhino horns, it's made of keratin and grows from a base on the rhino's snout.
So, a single powerful horn for defense and other purposes. What about their habitat and behavior? How do they differ from the African species?
Indian rhinos are typically found in grasslands and riverine forests in parts of India and Nepal. They're solitary animals except during mating season or when a mother is caring for her calf. And they're known for their love of wallowing in mud, which helps to regulate their body temperature and protect their skin from parasites.
I can picture them now, happily rolling around in a muddy pool. It's a reminder that even these massive creatures have their own unique quirks and behaviors.
Absolutely. Every species is fascinating in its own way. Now, shall we move on to the Javan rhinoceros?
Yes, let's talk about the Javan rhino. I know this species is critically endangered with only a small population remaining in the wild. What can you tell me about them?
The Javan rhino is a truly remarkable and tragic story. It's one of the rarest large mammals on Earth, with only an estimated 60 to 70 individuals remaining, all confined to a single national park in Java, Indonesia.
It's heartbreaking to think about how close they are to extinction. What has led to such a drastic decline in their numbers?
Habitat loss due to human encroachment and deforestation has played a major role. But like all rhino species, they've also been heavily impacted by poaching. In fact, the Javan rhino was once found throughout Southeast Asia, but their range has shrunk dramatically over the centuries.
So a combination of factors has pushed them to the brink. What can you tell me about their physical characteristics and behavior? How do they compare to the other rhino species?
The Javan rhino is similar in appearance to the Indian rhino, with its thick, armor-like skin folds. However, it's smaller, with males reaching up to 1,700 kilograms. And unlike the Indian rhino, the Javan rhino has a single, relatively small horn, typically less than 25 centimeters in length.
Okay, so a single small horn. That's interesting. Are there any theories about why their horn is so much smaller than that of the other rhino species?
It's not entirely clear why Javan rhinos have such small horns, but some scientists speculate that it may be related to their dense rainforest habitat. In this environment where visibility is limited, horns may be less important for defense or display than they are in open habitats.
That makes sense. It's a reminder that evolution is all about adaptation to specific environments.
Exactly. And speaking of adaptation, let's talk about the Sumatran rhinoceros, the last of the 5 extant rhino species. This species is truly unique, with a combination of characteristics that set it apart from all the others.
I'm ready to hear all about it. I know the Sumatran rhino is the smallest and hairiest of the rhino species, but what else makes them stand out?
The Sumatran rhinoceros is truly a living fossil. It's the most primitive of the living rhino species, retaining characteristics that link it to its ancient ancestors. And as you mentioned, it's the smallest, with adults typically weighing between 600 and 950 kilograms, and it's covered in a coat of reddish-brown hair, which gives it a distinctly fuzzy appearance.
I love the image of a fuzzy rhino. It seems like such a contrast to the other species, with their thick, armor-like skin. Why is the Sumatran rhino so hairy?
It's thought to be an adaptation to their high-altitude rainforest habitat where temperatures can be cooler than in the lowlands. The hair provides insulation and helps to keep them warm in the misty, mountainous forests of Sumatra and Borneo.
That makes sense. So a hairy coat for warmth. Another fascinating example of how rhinos have adapted to their environments. What about their horns? How do they compare to the horns of the other species?
Sumatran rhinos have 2 horns, like the African species. The front horn is typically longer, averaging around 25 centimeters, while the rear horn is much smaller, often just a knob. And interestingly, their horns are often described as being more slender and curved than those of other rhinos.
Okay, so 2 horns, but more slender and curved.
Yeah.
Got it. What about their behavior? How do they differ from the other species?
Sumatran rhinos are solitary creatures, rarely seen in groups except during mating season or when a mother is caring for her calf. They're also known for their vocalizations, which include a variety of snorts, whistles, and even screams.
Screaming rhinos, that's not something I would have expected.
It's true, they're actually quite vocal animals, and their calls can carry for long distances through the dense rainforest. It's one of the ways they communicate with each other and maintain their territories.
It's incredible to think about these massive, powerful animals communicating through the rainforest with such a variety of sounds. It really paints a picture of their complex social lives.
It does. Sadly, these incredible creatures are facing a very uncertain future. Sumatran rhinos are critically endangered with only a few hundred individuals remaining in the wild.
Right. We touched on that earlier. It's a recurring theme, unfortunately. All 5 rhino species are threatened to some degree. Can we delve into the specific threats they face, starting with poaching?
Of course, poaching is the most immediate and pressing threat to all rhino species. It's driven by the illegal wildlife trade, which profits from the sale of rhino horn, primarily in Asia.
I know we talked about this a bit earlier, but can you remind me why rhino horn is so sought after? What are the supposed benefits that drive this demand?
It's a complex issue rooted in a combination of cultural beliefs and criminal greed. In some parts of Asia, particularly Vietnam and China, rhino horn is believed to have medicinal properties, despite there being no scientific evidence to support these claims. It's also seen as a status symbol, a way for the wealthy to display their wealth and power.
So unfounded beliefs and a desire for status symbols are fueling this illegal trade. It's incredibly frustrating, especially knowing that rhino horn is made of the same material as our fingernails.
You're right, it's all about perception and the power of belief, even when those beliefs are contradicted by science. And unfortunately, this demand for rhino horn has led to a surge in poaching in recent decades, pushing some rhino species to the brink of extinction.
It's truly disheartening. But I know there are people and organizations working tirelessly to combat poaching and protect these animals. What are some of the strategies being used to address this crisis?
There are a number of approaches, and they often involve a combination of efforts. On the ground, many conservation organizations are working to strengthen law enforcement, increase patrols in rhino habitats, and improve surveillance technology to deter poachers.
So boots on the ground, making it harder for poachers to operate.
Exactly. And there are also efforts to reduce the demand for rhino horn by educating consumers, changing cultural attitudes, and working with governments to enforce stricter laws and penalties for those involved in the illegal wildlife trade.
It sounds like a multifaceted approach, tackling both the supply and demand sides of the issue.
Mm.
Are there any other strategies being used?
There are a few more controversial approaches, such as dehorning, which involves removing the rhino's horn to make it less attractive to poachers. And there's also research being done on creating synthetic rhino horn in the lab, which could potentially flood the market and reduce the price of real horn, making poaching less profitable.
Those are interesting but definitely controversial ideas. I can see how they could be effective in deterring poaching, but I imagine there are ethical concerns as well.
You're right, there are definitely ethical considerations. Dehorning, while potentially effective in the short term, raises concerns about animal welfare and the long-term impacts on rhino behavior. And the idea of synthetic rhino horn is debated, with some arguing that it could legitimize the trade and make it harder to enforce bans on real horn.
It seems like there's no easy solution to this complex problem.
You're right. It requires a multifaceted approach, combining on-the-ground conservation efforts, law enforcement, education, and a global commitment to tackling the illegal wildlife trade.
It's a reminder that conservation is not just about protecting individual animals. It's about addressing the root causes of the threats they face and working to create a world where they can thrive.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that rhinos are not just individual animals. They're keystone species, playing vital roles in their ecosystems. Their loss would have cascading effects on the health and biodiversity of their environments.
It's a reminder that the fate of rhinos is intertwined with our own. We have a responsibility to protect these magnificent creatures for future generations.
We do. And it's not just about responsibility. It's about recognizing the intrinsic value of these animals and the incredible diversity of life on Earth. Rhinos are a symbol of wilderness, strength, and resilience. They deserve our respect and our protection.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative and thought-provoking deep dive. I've learned so much about the 5 rhino species, their evolutionary history, the threats they face, and the efforts being made to protect them. I'm left with a sense of both awe and concern, but also hope that we can turn the tide and ensure their survival.
I share that hope. The challenges are daunting, but there are dedicated people and organizations working tirelessly to protect rhinos. And ultimately, the fate of these magnificent creatures rests in our hands. We have the power to choose a future where rhinos continue to roam the earth for generations to come.
What a powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. I know we'll never look at a rhino the same way again.
It's been a pleasure. Remember, awareness is the first step towards action. The more we learn about rhinos and the threats they face, the more empowered we are to make a difference.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of rhinoceroses. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and feel inspired to learn more and get involved in rhino conservation efforts. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.